All right, so I had some technical difficulties yesterday during my Google Meet, and I forgot to record it. So I'm just going to make a quick video going over everything that I went over during yesterday's Google Meet, so those of you who aren't able to attend have access. So the first thing is I went over this tab on the classwork stream. Okay, so if you see this end of course review, underneath the lessons and assignments, there are lots of different materials that I have added here that you can use to review for the exam. So we're going to go over the test taking tips and foundational documents and Supreme Court cases in later Google Meets, but all of that information is there. I've also linked the crash course videos. We've watched a couple this year for assignments, but if there's any kind of topic that you're really not sure about or that you kind of want to review a little bit further, this is a link to the crash course. They've got everything from Congress to the Constitution to the linkage institutions, civil rights, everything's there. So definitely a good resource if you just need a quick review of any topic. I've included a link to a summary of the articles of the Constitution, and it also has a summary of each of the 27 amendments, so that can also be helpful with your final projects. So just so you're aware, all of that is there. All right, so let's get into what I wanted to talk to you about today, and that is the FRQs. So we've practiced each of these so far, but I just kind of wanted to drive home what you can expect to see on the AP exam and then talk about the task verbs. So as you know, there are 4 different types of FRQs on the AP exam. The concept application, quantitative analysis, Supreme Court comparison, and then the argument essay. And you will have 4 FRQs total that you will have to complete on the exam, and it will be one of each type of those FRQs. So the first type is that concept application, and this is the question or the FRQ that's going to give you some sort of scenario. You might have a reading or some sort of quote from a president or another political figure, some sort of situation that you have to discuss in your response. So really, this question is assessing your ability to describe and explain the effects of a political institution, behavior, or process. So what this question is asking you to do is take information that you have learned in class. It might be about Congress. It might be about the president and the presidential powers. It could be about what the Supreme Court can do, linkage institutions, so on and so forth. All of the different concepts that we've covered in class. Taking those concepts and applying it to whatever scenario, quote, reading, situation, whatever it is, in the prompt. The next type is that quantitative analysis. We practiced a couple of these back in like December and January. These are the questions that give you some sort of data. So it might be a table, a graph, a map, an infographic, some sort of chart with information on it. So this is where you're essentially going to be asked to analyze the data in that table or that graph. So describing the data, identifying trends and differences, drawing conclusions based on the data, so on and so forth. So looking at whatever data that they have provided with you or provided for you and then answering the questions. The next is the Supreme Court case comparison. So this is the question that we actually practiced yesterday. Again, you had another one of those assignments. So this gives you a description of a non-required Supreme Court case, which means it's a case that we have not covered at all in class. You're going to be unfamiliar with. It's going to give you information on that case and then give you the ruling in that case, okay, or the holding in that case. And you're going to have to compare that non-required case with a case that you are required to know for the AP exam. So for example, in the one that you just did this week, it is Hernandez v. Texas, which we didn't talk about in class, and comparing it with Brown v. Board of Education, which we definitely covered in class, and that you have to know for the AP exam. So you are just essentially going to be asked to identify similarities and differences, describe the reasoning behind the cases, explaining similarities and differences. And then the last one, and the one that we probably practice the most, is the argument essay. And I think this one tends to be the toughest. So this is the prompt that's first going to ask you to articulate a defensible claim or a thesis that responds to the question and establishes a line of reasoning. So the first thing you have to do is respond to the prompt by developing some sort of argument or developing your thesis. Then you have to use evidence. So you have to have two pieces of evidence in the argument essay. One piece of evidence is going to come from the list of foundational documents that is provided to you in the prompt. So you'll often see the Constitution, Federalist Papers, things like that. So one piece of evidence comes from that list. The second piece of evidence can either come from another document on that list or just some sort of course concept, something that you've learned in class. So two pieces of evidence. The big thing here that I really want to drive home is that you have to make sure that you're using reasoning to explain your evidence, okay? So if you are using the First Amendment of the Constitution as one of your foundational documents and you just talk about freedom of speech, well, that's great that you know what the First Amendment says, but you need to explain, use that reasoning, okay, to give the scorer, okay, let them know that you are able to support your argument, okay? So explain how that piece of evidence is supporting whatever your thesis is. And then you will have to respond to an opposing or alternate perspective using refutation, concession, and rebuttal. So the breakdown of the FRQs, they're worth 50% of your overall exam score. So half of your score comes from multiple choice, half comes from the FRQ. Each FRQ is worth 12.5% of your overall score. Concept application is worth 3 points. You get 20 minutes to do that. Quantitative analysis is worth 4 points. You get 20 minutes to do that. The Supreme Court case comparison is worth 4 points, 20 minutes for that. And then the argument essay is worth 6 points, and you get 40 minutes for that. I put on here to be familiar with the scoring rubric. That is available to you on Google Classroom. It's been there all year under the FRQ resources tab. So I would definitely recommend going back and looking at that rubric. All right, so let's go over the task verbs. And again, we've already talked about some of these already this year, but I want to make sure to really drive home how important it is to know these task verbs. Because in order to get the points on your FRQs, okay, you have to be able to respond to the prompt and do what the prompt is asking you to do. So first, if it asks you to identify, that means it's really just asking you to provide information about a specific topic. You don't have to elaborate or go into deep explanation. If it asks you to identify, your response can be as short as one sentence. So this can be a short answer. So for example, the free speech clause is part of the Bill of Rights that protects the opinion polling referenced in the scenario. So essentially that sentence is restating the prompt and answering the question. If it asks you to describe, this is going to be a little more elaborate than identification. So if it's asking you to describe, think that you're probably going to respond in at least 2 to 3 sentences to really make sure that you are hitting all of the relevant details. So here you can use definitions, give examples, point out similarities and differences, describe a pattern. So you are providing all of the relevant characteristics of that specific topic. So here it talks about the free speech clause, okay, in terms of Tinker v. Des Moines, and it also points out differences. So reading that example, you can see that there are a lot more details given in that example than in identification and just that short sentence answering the question. And then the last one is explaining or using reasoning. And when I'm grading FRQs, this is the problem that I tend to run into the most. So this is a more expanded description, and you're going to have to include causation. So what I mean here is you probably are going to need to use the word because when you're explaining something, you need to answer the question of how or why something is the way it is. So you're providing information about how or why a relationship, process, pattern, position, situation, or outcome occurs using evidence and or reasoning. So the example here is the free speech clause could be seen as more important than voting rights because even when relatively few citizens vote in a local election, local officials might be more willing to change policy when a large number of residents use their rights to free speech to protest for a change in policy. So it's saying that the free speech clause could be seen as more important than voting rights because, and then this is the explanation of why. So you're using that word because you have to get to the why or the how or something if you are explaining. All right, and then a few more task verbs that you might see. It might ask you to compare. So this is when you are providing similarities and differences. If it asks you to define, you are literally just going to be giving the definition for a word or a concept or a term. To develop an argument, that's when you are developing that thesis, okay, or setting up your claim and using reasoning to develop your argument. And then if it asks you to draw a conclusion, you're more than likely going to see this in one of those quantitative analysis questions where it's going to be asking you to look at some sort of chart or graph and then formulate some sort of statement that demonstrates your understanding of that information in the chart or graph. All right, so just a few quick tips for FRQs. You can break the question into parts, okay? So if you want to, if it has 3 parts, you can actually do part A, part B, part C, chunk it out. You don't have to write it all in one big paragraph. Be specific in your writing and examples. Free response can be kind of a misleading name for these open-ended questions because you need to answer the questions correctly. Use examples and analysis when requested. On graph and data questions, make sure to refer to the graph. So in your response, it can say something like, based on the information in the chart or according to the graph or something of that nature to answer the questions. Answer the question with facts. Do not give opinions on politics. This is a big one too that I sometimes see in your all's responses. Make sure that you are just using course concepts to answer the questions, okay? Taking information that you've learned in class, facts. You're not providing your opinion, okay? FRQs are not necessarily opinion-based questions. And then use complete sentences. You can take a couple of minutes to brainstorm before you actually start writing, okay? So read through the question, read through each part of the question, and think about how you want to respond before you actually get started. One other thing that I definitely want to drive home, especially on these argument essays, is sometimes we get caught up in this idea of writing an essay and that it has to be this really long essay. It doesn't have to be, okay? You're not writing a 5-paragraph essay with an introduction and then the body paragraphs and the conclusion. Flowery introductions and conclusions for this exam aren't needed. It's not necessary. So you can literally, especially when you are writing those argument essays, start with your thesis statement, include your evidence, both pieces of evidence, and then your rebuttal, okay? It can be that simple. You do not have to write a huge, long essay. Use language in the prompt to provide a clear answer. I would definitely always recommend to restate the question, okay? Restate the prompt in your answer. That way, it's going to make it a little easier for the scorer to know that you're on the right track. Use the language in the prompt. Okay, I just went over that one, sorry. Know course vocabulary and terminology, but don't try to use terminology that you're not familiar with. So if you're not super familiar with a term or it's kind of vague, you might try to use something else or not even try to use that specific term. You don't want to accidentally use a term incorrectly. So if you're not super familiar with it, don't use it. Pay close attention to the dates and times used in the prompt. So here I've kind of gave the example of if it's asking you to compare a presidency of George Washington and President Obama, they all obviously served during 2 completely different time periods. So that's going to be completely different. And even though you probably won't get a question like that, just keep that in mind when you're reading the questions. And then try to answer every part of each question. You will not lose points for incorrect answers. This is super important too. So each question is going to have multiple parts, A, B, C, so on and so forth. Make sure that you're answering each part of the question. Even if you're having to kind of take an educated guess on one part, that's better than leaving it blank. So getting something incorrect, you're not going to lose points, but if you don't do it at all, you're going to get no points for that part. So at least give it a shot, you might get it right. So those are my FRQ tips. A couple things, I just wanted to show you a couple of concept application questions, just so you can kind of see the task verbs and what they look like in the different prompts. So this one says, initially the United States Constitution did little to protect citizens from actions of the states. In the 20th century, the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution to protect the rights of citizens from state governments in a process referred to as incorporation. So we talked about selective incorporation. during our civil rights, civil liberties unit. Okay, so we know what selective incorporation is. So the first part, part A, asks you to define selective incorporation. So define is one of those task verbs that we talked about. So we know that if it's asking us to define, then we just have to give the definition of that term. So you could simply say something along the lines of selective incorporation is when the Supreme Court, applies the Bill of Rights to state actions or state laws on a case-by-case basis. So you are literally just going to be giving the definition of that term. And then for part B, it says for two of the following, explain how each has been incorporated. Each of your explanations must be based on specific and relevant Supreme Court decisions. So two that stand out to me here when I look at these are the rights of criminal defendants and then privacy rights. So we definitely talked about Gideon v. Wainwright, and then we talked about Roe v. Wade in terms of privacy rights. So what you would do is explain, remember you're explaining how, that those have been incorporated, those cases. So in Gideon v. Wainwright, you would explain how the Sixth Amendment was incorporated, to the states, because everyone has the right to an attorney. So that was selective incorporation in terms of that Florida state law. When it comes to privacy rights, that case is Roe v. Wade. So you can talk there about how that was applied to state restrictions on abortions in terms of when states are actually allowed to start to restrict abortions and make those sorts of laws. So you are explaining how those cases have been incorporated. So that's a little bit about how you can take those task verbs, and respond to the prompt. What is it asking me to do? So that's something to definitely keep in mind as you're responding to these questions. So that is pretty much what we went over in yesterday's session. So if you have any questions about FRQs, please let me know.